The Winchester barrel was hot enough to blister bare skin, and Silas Holloway was using it anyway. He crouched behind the sandbags at the south porch of his own cabin, the summer sun already high over New Mexico, the smell of black powder thick in the still morning air. A dozen men were dying on the ridge above him, some of them his friends, most of them strangers who had ridden to this ground to pass judgment on a woman and had stayed to fight a war they had not come for. Beside him, pressed to the sandbags with her back to the cabin wall, an Apache woman was thumbing fresh rounds into the loading gate of an old Colt revolver. Her hair, black as creek water at midnight, was bound in a single thick braid down her back. Her dress, a pale cotton stitched in another woman's hand, was dark with somebody else's blood. She had not made a sound in the last 5 minutes, not even when a bullet from the rocks had split the porch post 6 inches above her head. Silas looked at her. 4 weeks earlier, he had not known her name. 4 weeks earlier, he would have told any man who asked that his life was 3 graves under a cottonwood tree and nothing more. Now, here she was loading a dead boy's revolver beside him, more alive than he had been in 2 years. From the split rock 200 yards up the western ridge, a voice came down over the gunfire. It was hoarse from shouting, but Silas knew it. He had heard it once before in his own barn, laughing at a thing one of the other men had said while they were still in the kitchen. He had carried that laugh in his chest like a splinter for 23 months. "Holloway, you still walking?" Silas did not answer. "I done her in 85. Holloway, I kept your Mabel an hour and a half, your boys too. You think you can hide from me a second time?" The woman beside him. Her name was Harlow. Now the name of a grandmother who had once crossed an ocean alone, closed her hand around his forearm. Her grip was hard. "Silas," she said low, "he is baiting you. I know it. Do not go. I have to." She did not argue. She thumbed the last round into the Colt and set the cylinder with a small, precise click, and she looked at him across 6 inches of sandbag and smoke, and she said, "Then you come back. I have not given you leave to die." Silas almost smiled. He would have smiled if the man in the rocks had not been the same man who had once on a September afternoon stood in his kitchen and done a thing that could not be undone, and laughed then too. He thumbed a fresh round into the Winchester. The brass caught the morning light for half a breath, and then was gone. The screen faded to black. 4 weeks earlier, dawn came slow over the high country of New Mexico territory, the sky going from black to bone gray, to a pale, unwilling pink. Out on the western rise where the grass gave up and the rock took over, the light touched a single cabin first. Log walls, a sod roof settling in the middle, a stone chimney stained with 20 years of smoke. Beyond it, a kitchen garden that had surrendered to the drought. Beyond that, a corral with a sorrel mare and a mule. Beyond that, the open land running flat to a horizon that did not end so much as dissolve. Silas Holloway was 48 years old that summer, and he already looked like a man carved out of the land he was losing. He rose before the rooster, because the rooster had died the winter before. and he had not bothered to buy another. He pulled on his boots in the dark, not needing light for a thing he had done 10,000 times. He built up the stove. He filled the coffee pot from the wooden bucket beside the door. He measured the grounds by the hollow of his palm. All the small rituals a man keeps when there is no one left to cook for but himself. When the coffee was ready, he poured 2 tin cups. He carried them both out the back door. Behind the cabin stood a cottonwood tree older than any living man in that county. Under its branches, 3 wooden crosses leaned slightly in the packed earth. They were set in a row, the tallest in the middle, the shortest on the right. Silas had carved every letter himself slowly with a pocket knife during the long winter after the killing. Mabel Holloway, 1845 to 1885. Beloved. Amos Holloway, 1872 to 1885. My first boy. Tobias Holloway, 1875 to 1885. Toby. Taken young. Silas sat down on the flat stone he had set there for himself. He set 1 cup of coffee on the ground in front of Mabel's cross. He kept the other. "Morning, Mabel," he said. "Morning, Amos. Morning, Toby." The wind moved once in the cottonwood leaves. That was always the answer he got, and it was always enough. "Bankman's coming Thursday," he told them. "I owe him 600 and change. If the Santa Fe drive goes right, I'll clear it. If it don't, well." He took a long swallow of the coffee. "Well, then your Grandpa Holloway's land goes to a man in Denver who's never smelled it. I won't let that happen. You got my word on that, Mabel." He finished his coffee slow. He did not hurry around that tree. He had learned in the 2 years since the killing that hurrying through a grave was a kind of second murder. When he finally stood up, the sun had cleared the ridgeline. He poured Mabel's coffee out on the dirt at the foot of her cross, the way he did every morning, and the dry ground took it gratefully. "I'll see you tonight," he said. "God willing." He saddled the sorrel and rode out to count cattle. A man who talks to the dead long enough stops being sure which side of the conversation he is on. He rode the northern fence line first the way he always did. 200 head of beef, give or take, scattered across the bottomland, where the grass still came up thin and blue after a rain. He counted them in his head, as he rode the way another man might say, a rosary. He had learned to count cattle from his father. His father had learned from his. The man from Denver would not know how to count them, Silas thought, and the thought put a hot, brief ache in his chest. That had nothing to do with cattle. By mid-morning, the sun was already cruel. He reined up at the creek bottom to water the sorrel and pulled his hat low against the glare. A calf was missing. He could feel it before he confirmed it the way a shepherd feels a hole in the fold. He tracked the stray down the arroyo for half a mile into a stretch of broken country where the red dust lay thick and unmarked by hoof. That was where he found her. At first, he thought it was a pile of cloth somebody had dumped from a wagon. Then the pile moved just slightly, the way a living thing moves when it has run out of anything else to do but breathe. Silas drew the Winchester and slid down from the saddle in one quiet motion. The old instincts came back slow and cold. He had ridden with a cavalry company for 2 years in the 60s, and before that he had worked a trail from the Pecos to Abilene with men who slept with one eye open, because the other eye had already been taken by someone who had not. He did not rush. He swept the rocks above him first. He looked for hoofprints and found none but his own. He looked for the shadow of a rider on the ridge and saw nothing but a turkey vulture doing slow circles against the blue. Then he knelt. She was a woman. Apache, he thought, or half he was no authority on such things with skin-burned copper by a long walk without water, and black hair matted to her skull with dried blood. Her wrists had been bound with rawhide that had cut into the flesh and then swollen past the cord, so that the leather had nearly disappeared into her arms. Her dress, what remained of it, was a coarse brown weave, and her back, Silas let out a long breath. Her back was a map of old suffering and new. There were scars there, pale and raised, that were weeks old. And there were fresh welts over the scars, bright and wet, and only just crusting, that were days old, maybe less. Whoever had done this to her had done it more than once, and not long ago, and had taken their time. He pressed 2 fingers to the side of her neck. The pulse was there just. It came like a watch winding down. He looked around again. There was no sign that anyone had brought her here. No drag marks. No ring of hoofprints where riders had dismounted and then remounted. It was as if the wind had set her down in the dust and ridden on. He was reaching for his canteen when he saw the small thing on the leather thong around her neck. It was a piece of wood. A piece of wood no bigger than a man's thumbnail, worn smooth on one side and carved on the other. Carved with the figure of a standing buckhead, lifted antlers thrown back. The lines were rough but patient. A boy's knife work. Silas went very still. He knew that carving. He had taught the boy how to make it. 2 winters passed during the long nights after Christmas. He had sat Amos down by the fire with a piece of pine and shown him how to rough out a deer with just 4 cuts. He could see Amos now, the 13-year-old concentration. The tongue poked out the side of his mouth, the way his whole small frame leaned into the knife. Amos had made 6 of them that winter. He had given one to his mother. Silas reached out with a hand that did not want to obey him, and he turned the wooden deer over in the sunlight, and he knew it for what it was. This was his wife's. He closed his fingers around it. He breathed out long and slow through his teeth. Somewhere, he thought, somewhere out in the country, he could not see a man had carried this small carving away from Mabel's body on a September afternoon 2 years ago, had kept it, had put it around the neck of a dying woman in the red dust, had left her here as if daring the world to make sense of it. A colder man might have gotten back on his horse and ridden away and told himself he had seen nothing. Silas Holloway was not a cold man. He had tried to be after the killing. He had tried very hard. It had not taken. He cut the rawhide from her wrists with his belt knife. He slid his arms under her and lifted. She weighed almost nothing. Living women, in his experience, had a weight to them that had as much to do with spirit as with flesh. This one had spent her spirit on the simple act of not dying yet, and there was little left to carry. He laid her across the saddle mounted up behind her and rode home at a walk, because a trot would have killed her. He did not look back at the place where he had found her, but he memorized it, because someone somewhere had wanted him to find her. And Silas Holloway had lived long enough to know that when the world wants you to find a thing, it is usually because the world is not done with you yet. He laid her down on the quilt in front of the hearth that evening, and he set about the work of keeping her alive. He had done this before, though not for a person. He had pulled calves out of breech berths in snowstorms. He had sewn up a gelding's flank after a bad wire cut. A body was a body in the end, and blood knew the same laws whether it came from a cow or a woman. He cleaned her wrists first because they were the worst, and then her back, working on his knees on the plank floor until his own knees burned from it. He used half a bottle of whiskey, the good kind he had been saving for nothing, and a clean flour sack cut into strips. When he pressed the whiskey to the welts, she moaned low in her throat, a sound more animal than human, but she did not wake. He got water past her lips a drop at a time with a folded rag. He built the fire up and then banked it back so the heat would be steady. He laid one of Mabel's old wool blankets over her, the blue one, with the frayed edge, and as he tucked it under her shoulder, his hand shook just once, and he made himself stop and breathe. Then he sat down in the rocker across from her with the Winchester across his lap, and he watched her chest rise and fall in the firelight, and he waited. Midnight came. He did not sleep. He thought about the wooden deer. He thought about what it meant that it was around her neck. He thought about the quiet, careful way he had lied to everyone in the county for 2 years about how his family had died. Fever, he had told them, came on quick, took them inside of a week. Orrin Bellamy had let him say it. The minister had believed him. The man from the bank who had come out the following spring for the first of many unhappy conversations had believed him. And every time Silas had said the word fever, the lie had gotten a little smaller and a little harder, like a stone he was swallowing one morning at a time. Because the truth was that he had come home from a 3-day cattle delivery in El Paso on the afternoon of the 23rd of September in the year 1885, and he had found his wife on the kitchen floor, and he had found his oldest boy dead against the back door with his father's empty shotgun in his hands, and he had found his youngest boy at the bottom of the well, and he had sat down in his own blood-stained kitchen, and he had said to God very quietly, "You and I are done." He had never told another living soul what he had walked into that afternoon. Not the sheriff in Red Butte, not Orrin, not the preacher. He had buried them himself at night with a lantern because he could not bear the thought of strangers looking at what had been done to them. He had said fever because murder would have brought questions he did not have the strength to answer. And now, 2 years later, a woman he had never seen was lying in his front room wearing Amos's carving around her neck, and the stone in his throat was moving again. He did not sleep. Sometime past 2 in the morning she did. He heard the small change in her breathing before he saw her move. Then her head turned, Then slowly her eyes opened. In the firelight, they were very dark and very clear, and they went around the cabin, once cataloging the door, the window, the rifle across his knees, the distance to the kitchen before they settled on him. She did not scream. She did not speak. She moved the way a wounded animal moves when it has decided which of the two deaths in front of it is the better one. Her right hand slid out from under the blanket and reached across her body to the table beside the hearth, where Silas had left his kitchen knife after cutting bread for supper. Her fingers closed around the handle. She drew it under the blanket. She sat up inch by inch and pressed her back against the wall and held the knife low and pointed at him. Silas did not move. He did not raise the rifle. He did not lift his hands. He sat as he had been sitting, one boot crossed over the other, and he looked at her across the small distance of firelight and said in a voice as quiet as he could make it, "If you're going to do it, aim a little left of center and a little below the collarbone. That's where the heart is. I've been stabbed 8 times in my life. I know where it lives." Her eyes did not change. He said, "But if you only want to live through the night, set the knife down. I'm not the one who did this to you. I'm the one who pulled you out of the dirt." The fire popped. A small cinder jumped out onto the hearthstone and died. She did not set the knife down. Not right away. For a long moment he thought she would come across the room at him, and he thought also that he would let her. He was tired enough that night to be ready for whatever a stranger decided. But then, slowly the tension went out of her shoulders, not all the way, just enough. And the knife hand lowered and she slumped against the wall, as if the effort of lifting the blade had been the last thing she had in her. Silas stood up, carefully. He did not go near her yet. He went to the kitchen and he poured a tin cup of water from the pitcher, and he came back and set it on the floor within her reach, and he stepped away. "Drink slow," he said. "A lot at once, and you'll be sick." She looked at the cup. She looked at him. Then she took the cup in both hands because one would not hold it steady, and she drank small sips, her eyes never leaving his face. Silas sat back down in the rocker. "I don't know your name," he said. "I won't ask. A name is a thing a person gives. I'll wait." She drank. She did not speak. He slept sitting up that night with the Winchester across his lap and the kitchen knife on the floor between them. And when the gray first light came in through the oilcloth window, she was asleep against the wall, with the empty cup still cradled in her hands. He did not know it then, but the ghosts that had lived in that cabin for 2 years had begun very quietly to loosen their grip. They moved around each other for 3 days the way 2 horses move in a new pasture, each careful of the other's heels. He brought her broth. She drank it. He brought her bread. She ate it slowly, tearing small pieces with her fingers. He changed her bandages twice a day, turning his face when he had to lift her dress to reach her back, because privacy was the only gift he had to give a woman who had been given nothing but cruelty for a long time. She let him do it. She did not thank him. She did not need to. On the fourth day, she walked out of the cabin on her own. She did it while he was in the barn, and he only knew she had done it because the sorrel mare snorted once the way horses do when a stranger is near. He came out of the barn carrying a bridle and saw her standing in the doorway with one hand on the jamb and her feet bare on the boards. She was looking out at the land the way a woman looks at a room she is deciding whether to live in. He did not go to her. He stayed where he was and let her look. After a long time, she stepped down off the porch slowly, one step, two, and walked out into the yard. She walked to the edge of the garden. She touched the dead tomato vines with her fingertips. She walked to the corral and laid her hand on the top rail. The sorrel came over and breathed into her palm, and she stood there with her forehead pressed against the horse's neck for maybe half a minute. And Silas watched her shoulders move once, just once, and he looked away, because a man does not need to see everything a woman does. When she turned around and came back across the yard, she walked up to him and she said in English that was careful but clear, "I am Doba." It means the one who does not fight. My mother named me in the spring. I have stopped being her. Give me another name. Silas thought about it for longer than a man would have thought he needed to. Names were serious things in his family. His grandmother had carried hers from Scotland in a tin box of letters, and she had made the crossing alone when she was 16, and she had lived against every odd stacked on her head to 83 years of age, in a country she had chosen. Her name had been Harlow. Harlow Holloway. Silas's father had named Silas for a saint. His grandmother in private had called him by her own name instead, because she said a boy needed more than one defense in this world. Harlow, he said. It was my grandmother's. She crossed the ocean alone at 16. She didn't die of any of the things she was supposed to die of. It's a name for a woman who doesn't agree to be killed. The woman who had been Doba looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded very slight. Harlow, she said, testing it. Yes, that is a name I can wear. He put out his hand, awkward, not sure if she would take it. She looked at it. Then she laid her own hand palm down across his light as a bird settling. Silas Holloway, he said. I know, she said. You talk to the dead by the tree. I have heard you. You said their names in your sleep last night. It was in the second week that he took her into the east corner of the cabin because she had begun to clean, and she was about to find it on her own. The cradle stood under a piece of oilcloth in the corner that nobody had entered in 2 years. He had made it himself the summer Mabel told him Amos was on the way. He had shaped the rockers by hand. He had carved his wife's initials into the footboard very small, where only a mother would find them when she leaned in to check on a sleeping baby. Both boys had slept in it. He had not been able to burn it, and he had not been able to give it away, and he had not been able to look at it. And so he had covered it and let the dust do what dust does. Harlow pulled the oilcloth back before he could stop her, and she stood there with the cloth in her hand, and she did not make a sound. After a long moment, she reached down and laid one palm on the rail of the cradle. Her hand was very brown against the pale wood. She stood that way for what felt to Silas like a long time, and then her shoulders moved the way a thing moves when it has been held in too long, and he saw her face turn, and he saw a single line of wet cut down the dust on her cheek. She did not sob. She did not wail. The grief came out of her the way grief comes out of people who have already survived it once and know they will have to survive it again. He did what a man does who has no good words. He crossed the room and he put his hand on her shoulder, and he left it there. She did not move his hand away. After a while, she said, without looking at him, "I never held a child of my own. That is why I am here." He did not fully understand her yet. He would in time, but he said because it seemed to be the only true thing he had to offer. "I am sorry." "Do not be sorry for me," she said. "Be sorry for the child that was not born. I was only the house it did not come to." He nodded. He kept his hand on her shoulder. After a moment, she reached up and laid her own hand briefly on top of his, and then she walked out of that corner and did not go back into it again. But that night, he took the oilcloth off the cradle and folded it away, and he left the cradle standing uncovered, because some ghosts only get worse in the dark. Orrin Bellamy rode up on the 10th day. Silas saw him coming from a mile off, a single rider on a roan horse, with a short, easy stride he would have known anywhere. Orrin was 56 years old, lean as a fence rail, with hair that had gone the color of gun ash and a voice like someone dragging a chair over gravel. He was the only man in the county Silas had not lied to entirely, which was to say he was the only man in the county who had noticed Silas was lying and had let him keep doing it. Orrin swung down at the rail, saw Harlow on the porch, and stopped. He did not say anything for a long 10 seconds. He looked at her and he looked at Silas, and he took his hat off very slowly and turned it once in his hands. "Silas," he said. "Orrin. Can I speak to you?" "You can." "In private." They walked out to the barn. Orrin waited until they were inside out of the sun before he put his hat back on and said, "Do you know what you're doing, son?" "No," Silas said. "I have not known what I was doing for about 2 years." Orrin let that sit. "3 weeks back," he said, "a band of white riders came through the Pecos country. 8, maybe 9 of them. They burned 2 homesteads on the Gila. They took 2 women. One was a rancher's wife out of Socorro. The other was Apache wife of one of the Red Mesa men, from what the talk at Gunter's said. Folks figured both women for dead. And now you've got a woman on your porch with rope burns on her wrists and whip scars on her back, and you don't know what you're doing." Silas said, "She was left for dead in the arroyo south of my north pasture." "By who?" "I don't know yet." Orrin closed his eyes. He pinched the bridge of his nose the way a man does when he is trying not to say the first 7 things that come into his head. "Silas," he said, "the Red Mesa riders are going to come for her." "I know. And if those white riders come back first, you are 1 man with 1 rifle." "I know that too. And if you are dead," Orrin said very quietly, "Mabel's grave won't have anybody to pour coffee on it in the mornings." Silas looked at the dirt floor of the barn. He looked at the hay fork, leaning in the corner, the one Amos had been old enough to use the summer before he died. He said without looking up, Mabel would not have walked past her Orrin. And I won't either. Orrin breathed out through his nose. Then he walked to his horse and pulled two things from the saddle roll. A double-barrel shotgun, the stock worn smooth by his father's hand, and his grandfather's before that, and a small canvas sack of shells. He set them on the barrel beside Silas. "Then you aren't one man with one rifle," he said. "You send a boy to my place when you need me, day or night. You hear?" Silas did not trust himself to answer. He nodded. Orrin put his hat back on. At the barn door, he stopped without turning around. "Mabel would not have wanted you to die alone either," he said. "I think you've been forgetting that part." Then he was gone, and the sun came back into the barn, and Silas stood there a long time, with his hand on the stock of a shotgun he had no business owning. On the 12th day they came. He saw the dust first, then the riders, 3 of them, dropping down off the western ridge at a walk that was not hurried because it did not need to be. Silas was on the south side of the cabin, splitting wood, and he set the axe down and walked to the porch without running because he had learned from his father that a man who runs on his own land has already given away half of what the other fellow came for. Harlow came out of the cabin as the riders reached the last 50 yards. She had an old ashwood spear in her hand, the haft worn, and the iron point dull with age. Her shoulders were not quite steady, but she stood on the porch with the spear across her body and her chin up, and she looked at the lead rider the way a woman looks at a man she has once known. The lead rider was perhaps 32 years old. His hair was pulled back and tied at the nape of his neck with a strip of rawhide. His face was flat and hard, and could have been cut from the same red rock the ridge was made of. He stopped his horse at 40 feet and did not dismount. "White man," he said in a voice that was careful English, not broken but cold. "Send out the woman." Silas lifted the Winchester from where he had leaned it against the porch post, but he kept the barrel pointed at the ground. "She was left to die in my arroyo," he said. "I don't know by who. She stays with me until she is strong enough to choose different. She is not yours to keep." "She's not mine to keep," Silas agreed. "She's not yours to take either." The 2 riders behind the lead shifted their mounts. They were younger, both of them. One had a carbine across his lap. The other had nothing but a belt knife because he was the sort of man who did not feel he needed more than that. Harlow stepped down off the porch. She did not look at Silas. She walked to a spot 3 paces in front of him, and she stopped and she said something in her own language, quietly. The words were low and level, but Silas, who could not understand any of them, watched the face of the lead rider change. The change was very small. It happened around his eyes. But Silas had spent 20 years reading the face of every poker player and horse trader and cattle buyer between the Pecos and the Colorado, and he knew the look of a man who had just been struck in the chest by something he had not seen coming. Harlow spoke again. 1 sentence, short. The lead rider did not answer. The silence stretched out long enough that the younger rider with the carbine began to look at his leader sideways. Finally, the lead rider said in English so that Silas would understand, "The council will hear this. Not me. Not today." He turned his horse. The other two turned with him. At the top of the rise, he stopped and looked back down at the cabin. And for one long moment, he and Silas Holloway looked at each other across a quarter-mile of New Mexico air. And Silas understood something he had not expected. That man had loved her. Maybe still did. Then the three riders were gone over the ridge, and the dust came up in a long, slow curtain behind them. And Harlow was still standing in the yard with her spear, and she was breathing the careful, shallow breaths of a woman trying not to fall down. Silas walked out to her and stood at her shoulder. "Who was he?" he asked. He did not mean to ask it. He would have given the question back if he could. Harlow did not look at him. "Desan," she said. "7 moons ago I was his wife." Silas nodded slow. "All right," he said. "All right." That evening he rode the 12 miles to Red Butte for gunpowder and coffee, because a man needs one to live and the other to die. He tied up at the rail in front of the Dry Gulch Saloon a little after sundown. He had no intention of drinking, but Cormac behind the bar poured him a short whiskey without being asked the way Cormac did for men he thought looked like they needed the company of strangers. Silas sat with his back to the wall, as he had sat since 1885, and he drank the whiskey in small swallows that made no promise to finish it. And while he sat there, he heard 2 men at the table nearest the front door, speaking low enough that most of the room would not have heard them. "Jeb says we go back." "Back where?" "Holloway's country. He says the Apache woman ain't dead yet." "I thought we'd done with that." "Jeb ain't done. He's got a thing to finish with that one. Owed since 85. Same run as the rancher's woman." Silas's hand went very still on the glass. He did not turn his head. He did not change his face. He listened to the chairs scrape as the 2 men stood up. He watched them cross the room in the big mirror over the bar. A tall man with a burn scar down one cheek, and a shorter man with a neck like a bull, and nothing in his eyes. They went out through the batwing doors and into the street, and by the time Silas reached the door himself, they had already put their horses into a trot, heading west into the dark, toward the Boulder Creek country. He rode home hard that night, 3 hours without stopping the sorrel. The horse's sides lathered by the time he crested his own hill, the cabin windows still warm with lamplight. Harlow was at the stove stirring a pot. She turned when the door opened. She saw his face. "What is it?" "Nothing," Silas said. "Nothing yet." He hung the rifle on the pegs. He hung his hat. He washed his hands at the basin, and they shook against the tin until he pressed them flat. Because now he knew. He did not have all of it yet, but he knew enough. The man who had murdered his wife and his boys had done it in the same season, in the same year, with the same hands as whatever had first been done to the woman at his stove. And that man was not finished with either of them. Silas sat down at the table that night and cleaned the Winchester until 3 in the morning, slow and careful, the way a man cleans a thing he is about to use. Harlow watched him from the hearth for a long time, and she did not ask. She did not need to. Morning came gray and slow the way mornings do when a man has not slept. Silas Holloway stood on the back porch with a cup of coffee he had not touched, watching the light come up over the ridge where Desan and his 2 riders had disappeared the day before. The Winchester was propped against the doorframe within reach of his right hand. It had been within reach of his right hand for most of the night. Behind him, inside the cabin, Harlow was awake. He could tell by the small sounds of her moving the creak of the floorboard by the stove, the pour of water into the basin. She had slept perhaps 3 hours. He had heard her cry out once around midnight, low and choked, and he had sat very still in the rocker and waited to see if she wanted help. And she had not, and he had let her keep her privacy. He drank the coffee cold. When he came back inside, she was standing at the table braiding her hair. She had found somewhere in the chest at the foot of the bed one of Mabel's old cotton shirts, and she was wearing it over her own dress. The sleeves were too short for her arms. She looked up at him with the braid half finished in her hands, and she said, "You did not sleep." "No. You heard something in town." He set the empty cup on the table. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Put your shoes on. I want to show you where they are." She did not ask who. She tied off the braid and reached for her shoes. He led her out past the barn, past the corral, along the well-trod path that curved behind the cabin and under the cottonwood. The 3 crosses stood in a row in the packed earth, the tallest in the middle, the shortest on the right. In the morning light, the names he had carved were sharp and black. Harlow stopped at the edge of the small plot. She did not step onto the ground between the graves. That was a courtesy he had not asked of her, and it told him something about where she had come from. Silas took off his hat. He held it against his chest with both hands. "I have told a lie for 2 years," he said. "I told it to the sheriff. I told it to the preacher. I told it to Orrin Bellamy, who is the closest thing to a brother I have. I told it to myself every morning when I came out here to speak to them. And every morning the lie got a little heavier." Harlow did not speak. "I told them fever," Silas said. "I told them it came through quick. I told them I was too deep in grief to take visitors. Folks believed me because folks want to believe a thing like that. Fever is a story a country understands." He looked down at the cross on the left. "Mabel. In September of '85, I rode a lot of beef down to El Paso. 3-day ride each way and a day on the yard to sort and sell. I'd done it a dozen times. I kissed Mabel on the porch. I told Amos he was in charge of the horses. I told Toby to mind his mother. Toby was 10 years old. He saluted me. He was always saluting." A small, bitter smile moved across his mouth and was gone. "I came home on the afternoon of the 7th day. I saw the smoke from 3 miles out, and I told myself it was the stove. It was not the stove." He did not tell her everything. There were things a man did not say. Not in the morning, not under a tree, not to a woman who had her own hole in the sky. But he told her enough. He told her about the back door and the empty shotgun, and the boy who had not been taught to load it, and how a father carries that kind of failure every day after. He told her about the well. He told her that he had not told the truth, because he could not bear the way people would look at him if he did, and because he had been afraid in those first weeks that if he said the word murder aloud, he would ride out and do a murder of his own and never come back, and the graves would have nobody to tend them. When he finished speaking, Harlow stepped forward. She laid one flat palm against the wood of Mabel's cross. She stood that way for a long count. Then she said without turning, "I know who did this." Silas did not move. "The man at the saloon," she said. "The one you did not want to tell me about. You heard a name. Jeb." Harlow closed her eyes. "Jeb Crowley," she said. "He has a scar on his jaw in the shape of a cross. When he smiles, the scar pulls." Silas felt his whole body go cold from the collarbone down. "Describe him to me," he said. "Not the scar, the rest." She did. She described a tall man with black hair, cut rough at the shoulders, who rode a heavy bay horse and carried a knife in his left boot as well as his right. She described a younger man who rode with him nearly his height, but with yellow hair and a scar down the left cheek that she had watched come open when she bit him. She described a third man, nameless, big in the chest, slow in the tongue, who had not looked her in the eye once during the 2 weeks they had kept her. Silas sat down on the flat stone in front of Mabel's grave because his legs had decided for him. 2 weeks, he said. 2 weeks, she said. In a rock cut above Boulder Creek. They beat me for sport. The big one was not the worst. The yellow-haired one was not the worst. The one with the cross scar was the worst. On the last day, he sat in front of me and he told me in English so I would understand why he had chosen me. Silas looked up at her. Harlow's face was very still. He said, "Your husband killed my brother 2 springs ago when my outfit was passing through Apache country. I've been waiting a long time to answer for that. I also burned a rancher's family off their land, the same fall a white family up by Red Butte, just to stay in practice. Now it is your turn, and when they find you, your husband will understand that it was me." She took something from inside the shirt she was wearing. She held it out to him. "He put this on me on the last day," she said. "Before they rode away, he said, 'They will think a white man cared. They will think he left a kindness. Let your husband puzzle over it.'" In her palm lay the small wooden deer on its leather thong. Silas took it from her. He held it in both hands. He understood it all at once. The whole arithmetic of it. A man named Jeb Crowley had come across Holloway land in September of 1885 and had spent an afternoon doing the worst thing he could imagine to a family he had never met, because he was the sort of man who did such things to stay sharp. And then, months later, Dassan of the Red Mesa Riders had killed one of Jeb Crowley's brothers during some run-in on the Apache side of the country, of which Silas had never heard a word. And so a grievance had been born, and a grievance with a man like Jeb Crowley did not die. 2 summers later, Jeb had taken the woman Dassan had once loved. He had kept her in a hole in the ground for 14 days. He had left her for dead in the arroyo, with Mabel's wooden deer around her neck. Mabel's wooden deer which he had carried in his pocket for 23 months. Like a man carries a lucky coin so that when Dasan found her, Dasan would see the carving and know it belonged to some other dead family, some earlier victim, and would spend the rest of his life wondering who. But Dasan had not found her. Dasan's men had found her already past the point of saving in their estimate, and by the law of their people they had judged her soiled by white hands and had left her. And the wind had moved her a little further south than Jeb Crowley had planned. And Silas Holloway had come down the arroyo after a missing calf. And the world had closed a circle it had been drawing for 2 years. Silas sat on the flat stone under the cottonwood and turned the wooden deer over and over in his fingers. "Mabel sent you to me," he said very quietly. He was not sure he meant it the way it sounded. He was not sure he did not. "One way or another she sent you to me." Harlow knelt down in front of him in the dust. She took his hand, the one that held the carving, and she closed her own hand around it. "Then we will answer for both of them," she said. "Yours and mine." He looked at her. She did not look away. That afternoon he taught her to shoot. He had not planned to. He had planned to mend a stretch of fence on the south line and ride the cattle count. But when he came out of the barn with the post hole digger, she was already waiting in the yard. And the old Colt that had been Amos's was in her right hand, and she was looking at it the way a woman looks at a tool she has decided to understand. "I know the Apache way," she said before he could speak. "I know knives. I know the bow. I have not used a white man's gun." He nodded. He set up 6 empty whiskey bottles on the top rail of the corral 30 paces out. He stood behind her and he showed her the grip, the stance, the way to square her hip to the target. His hand closed over hers on the butt of the revolver just for a second to adjust the angle of her wrist, and he took the hand away again as soon as he could. She fired. She missed. She fired again. She missed. On the 4th shot, the bottle's second from the left burst into a small, bright cloud of green glass. Harlow made a sound he had not heard from her before. It was a laugh. It was short and surprised, and it came out of her like something had cracked loose in her chest and taken her unawares. Silas stopped. He stood in the yard, with the summer wind dragging across the grass, and he looked at her laughing with a smoking pistol in her hand and a length of his dead wife's shirt hanging past her wrist. And for the first time in a very long while, he felt a sensation in his chest that he did not at first recognize because it had been gone so long he had forgotten its name. It was gladness. He did not let it show. "Again," he said. "This time aim a finger width lower. The barrel lifts." She fired again. She hit the 3rd bottle. She turned to him, still half laughing, cheeks flushed, and she said, "I had forgotten I could do that." "Do what?" "Make that sound. I had forgotten I owned it." He nodded once, and he looked away, and he went back to the post hole digger. He did not tell her because it was not the right day that he had been forgetting he owned a few sounds himself. On the 22nd day, Jeb Crowley's brother came for them. Silas was working a stray heifer out of the willows along the North Creek alone, because Harlow was home mending the tear in her dress where the fence had caught it. The sun was high and the country was still. The sorrel smelled the riders before Silas did. The mare's ears went forward, then flat, and Silas was reaching for the Winchester in the saddle scabbard when the first shot cracked out of the brush. The bullet took him high in the right shoulder and knocked him sideways out of the saddle. He landed on his back in the dry grass. The sorrel bolted. The world for one clean second was nothing but blue sky and a roaring in his ears. Then he rolled. He rolled hard to his left into the cover of a half-fallen cottonwood, just as two more shots kicked dust out of the ground where he had been. 4 riders were coming down the slope at a hard trot, rifles out. Silas recognized the lead rider at once, though he had never seen him before in his life. Yellow hair, scar down the left cheek, the shape of his own brother in his face. Rance Crowley. Silas's right arm was useless. He dragged the Colt from his left hip with his left hand. The wrong hand he had not practiced enough with his left hand. He was going to die because he had not practiced, and he fired 3 times up the slope. One of the riders went sideways off his horse and did not get up. The other 3 kept coming. "I ain't here to kill you, Holloway," Rance called down cheerful as if they had met at a fence line. "I am here for the woman my brother has put $50 on her head, and I aim to collect." Silas fired again. The hammer snapped on an empty chamber. He had counted wrong. He was bleeding badly, and he had counted wrong. And he was going to die in a dry wash, half a mile from his own kitchen. He heard the hoofbeats from the south before he understood what they were. A single rider coming fast at a flat-out run. He turned his head and saw Harlow on the sorrel she had caught the sorrel, and she was coming up the wash at a full gallop, with the Winchester out of the saddle scabbard and her braid whipping behind her like a black rope. She did not slow down. She did not draw rein. She rode straight into the line of fire. She fired from the saddle 3 shots so close together that they sounded almost like one. The second rider pitched over the neck of his horse and didn't come up. The third rider turned his horse to run. Rance Crowley fired back. The shot went wild. Silas heard it whine past his own ear, and then Harlow had wheeled the sorrel and was firing again, and Rance was screaming something incoherent with his hand to his face. And then he too was gone, spurring his horse back up over the ridge and out of sight, with his hand pressed to his head and blood running between his fingers. The fourth rider had already broken and was running the other way. Silence came down over the wash, the way silence comes after thunder, thick and buzzing and unreal. Harlow swung down off the sorrel before the mare had fully stopped. She hit the ground running. She was on her knees beside him before he had time to sit up. Her hands were everywhere, his shoulder, his chest, his face, and she was saying something low and fast, half in English and half in her own language, and he could not follow all of it, but he understood enough. "Stop," he said. His voice came out thinner than he wanted. "Stop, Harlow. I'm not done yet." "Shoulder," she said. "Through and through. lost blood. Stay down. Horse. I have the horse. She tore a long strip from the hem of her dress right there in the wash, and she packed the wound front and back with it, and cinched it under his armpit. Her hands didn't shake. Her hands had clearly done this before. He remembered what he had seen on her back, and he understood not for the first time that the woman kneeling over him had learned her medicine in places he did not care to imagine. She got him onto the sorrel somehow. He did not remember how. He remembered her voice steady in his ear. Lift your leg, Silas, lift your leg. And he remembered the cool of her forehead against his when she swung up behind him in the saddle and took the reins around his body. And he remembered the slow rocking walk of the mare, carrying them both back toward the cabin. And then for a while he did not remember anything at all. He came back to himself in his own bed at night with a bandage pulled tight across his chest and the taste of whiskey burning in the back of his throat. Harlow was sitting beside the bed in the kitchen chair. The lamp was turned low. She had a needle in her hand and a bowl of red water in her lap, and when she saw his eyes open, she set both aside and leaned forward and laid the back of her hand against his forehead, with the careful competence of a woman who had been tending fevers since she was a girl. Still here, she said. Still here, he agreed. You called me 3 names while you were under. Did I? You called me Mabel. You called me Harlow. And you called me by my first name, the one I have put down. He looked at her. He did not ask which one he had called her most. He was not sure he wanted to know. She said, "It does not matter." All 3 of us were in the room. He slept again. Somewhere west of Silas Holloway's cabin, in a box canyon on the backside of the Boulder Creek country, a different fire was burning. Jeb Crowley sat on an upturned saddle with his boots stretched out toward the flames. He was a tall man of 44, long-armed, with a face that had been handsome once before the scar on his jaw had pulled his mouth a little out of true. He wore his black hair long and loose. He wore his pistol on his left hip because he had been left-handed from the cradle, and the pistol had been his father's before it was his. He drank coffee black out of a tin cup, and he listened and he did not interrupt. Rance stood on the other side of the fire with a bandage around his head. The bullet had cut a long groove above his left ear. Another inch to the right, and Rance would have been a corpse in a wash in New Mexico, and Jeb would have had one less brother than he had woken up with that morning. Woman can shoot, Rance was saying. His voice was tight with humiliation. I didn't figure her for that. She came out of the South like a damn cavalry charge, Jeb. She put Lou down, she put Frank down, and she nearly put me in the ground. I had no cover. The rancher was hit. I thought we had him. And then the woman come over the ridge on his horse like the devil's own. Quiet a minute, Jeb said. Rance stopped. Jeb looked into the fire. He took a slow swallow of the coffee. The rancher, he said. What did he look like? Big man, gray in the beard. Hit hard but not dead. The Apache woman took him back toward a cabin north of Red Butte. North of Red Butte? Jeb said. Yeah. Jeb set the cup down between his boots. He reached into the pocket of his coat and took out a tobacco pouch. And from inside the tobacco pouch, he took a small folded piece of buckskin, and from inside the buckskin, he took a single lock of brown hair tied with a length of green thread. He held it up to the firelight. 2 years ago, he said, I took that off a white woman in her own kitchen. Her name was Mabel Holloway. She fought me with a fry pan for near a quarter hour before I got the better of her. She had one boy at the back door with an empty scattergun, and another one I dropped down a well. Her husband was in El Paso. I have been saving this piece of her ever since. I meant to send it to him one day when I was ready to see what he had grown into. Rance stared at the lock of hair. Jeb put it back into the buckskin, and the buckskin back into the pouch, and the pouch back into the coat. I reckon he's grown, Jeb said. I reckon he's grown quite a bit. Jeb, Rance said carefully, let it lay. We can ride south. Sonora. There's work. We don't need the woman. Jeb looked up at his brother. The scar at his jaw pulled when he smiled. Rance, he said, not unkindly. Every one of the boys I have ever ridden with has told me to let a thing lay at one time or another. I have never once done it. It is why they follow me, and it is why they die with me. I am not going to let this lay. I am going to go to that rancher's cabin, and I am going to burn it to the ground, and I am going to kill every living creature that walks out of it, and then I am going to take the woman, and then I am going to come home and sleep one clean night. He picked up the cup again. You get the boys, he said. All of them. I want 12 guns on that ridge inside 4 days. I want powder. I want a fresh string. We will ride at dawn on the 5th day, and we will be across his fence line before the sun is up. Rance did not argue. Rance knew better. He said, yes, Jeb. And then he went to saddle a fresh horse because men like Rance Crowley obeyed men like Jeb Crowley until the day they died of it. On the 28th day, a single rider came out of the north alone and stopped his horse a quarter mile from the cabin. Silas was on the porch with his right arm in a sling Harlow had sewn from a piece of sheeting. He was 4 days past the bullet and moving badly but moving. He watched the rider with the Winchester across his lap, and he knew the silhouette before he knew the face. Dasan had come back without his men. The Apache rider dismounted at the fence. He walked in with his hands open and empty, the reins of his horse trailing behind him in the dust. He stopped at the gate, and he called out in English, I will speak with her. Only her. Harlow came out onto the porch. She had Amos's colt on her hip. She looked at Silas. He nodded once. She walked down off the porch and out to the gate. Dasan bowed his head slightly as she came up, and then he lifted it again, and then the two of them began to speak. Silas could not hear the words, and if he could have, he would not have understood them. They stood a few feet apart at the gate, and they spoke for nearly an hour. Twice she turned her face away. Once she laid her hand flat on the top rail and closed her eyes. Once Dasan reached out as if to touch her shoulder, and then lowered his hand again without touching her. Silas sat on the porch with the rifle on his knees, and he watched. he did not interrupt, and he made no attempt to read either of their faces. He had a quiet thought while he watched. The thought was that if he were a different sort of man, a younger one or a harder one, he would have felt the start of something ugly under his ribs right then. Jealousy. The small green animal that lived in the chest of every man who had ever loved a woman. He waited for it. He was a little surprised when it did not come. What came instead was something more complicated. A kind of quiet recognition. That man out there at the gate had loved Harlow once, had failed her, had known it, was living with the knowing as Silas himself lived with his own. There was a brotherhood of failed men in this world, Silas thought. And it did not matter what color their skin was or what god they prayed to. The brotherhood was everywhere. After a long time, Dasan mounted his horse and rode away. Harlow walked back to the porch. She sat down on the step below Silas's chair, her back against the post, and for a full minute she did not speak. Then she said, "Nantan is coming. The chief. He is bringing the whole council. 50 riders. 3 days." Silas exhaled slowly. "He is coming for a final judgment," she said. "They will hear my case at the gate of your house. If they rule for me, I am welcome at my tribe's fire again. If they rule against me, I am declared dead to them forever. No one will speak my name among the people. My mother's 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 name falls silent with mine. That is the harder judgment." He nodded. He had suspected as much. She turned and looked up at him. "Dasan also said this," she said. 4 white men came to the village 3 days ago. They offered trade for any news of me. They said they would pay in silver coin and in rifles. Nantan turned them away, but they went away knowing I was alive, and they went away knowing I was here. Jeb. Jeb. He rubbed his good hand over his jaw. The stubble was 3 weeks past shaving. "Then they're coming too," he said. "They are coming too. Likely the same day. Likely the same day." She looked out at the land. The sun was going down behind the western ridge. The light came in long and red across the yard and lay on the top rail of the fence like the last coal in a stove. "Silas," she said. "Yeah, I do not want to go back with him." He did not answer right away. "All right," he said. "I want you to know that before the day comes," she said, "in case the day goes badly, I do not want you to carry the question." "All right," he said again. She was quiet a moment. "I wanted you to know it for you," she said, "more than I wanted you to know it for me." He did not turn his head to look at her. He was afraid if he did, he would say something he could not take back. And he was not a man who trusted himself with words he could not take back. He only said after a long time, "Thank you." She nodded and she stood up and she went inside to start the evening meal. They had 3 days. They used them. Orrin Bellamy rode over on the first day with an extra shotgun, 4 boxes of shells, and a face set for business. Silas met him at the gate and did not bother to argue. Orrin dismounted, pulled the bedroll from behind his saddle, and dropped it inside the door of the cabin, as if he had always lived there. "Etta passed last winter," Orrin said without looking at him. "Kids are grown. The boy's clerking in Denver. The girl married a man in Taos. She don't need my blessing on. If I'm gonna be any use to anybody, it will be here, Silas. Don't make me say any of this twice." Silas did not make him say it twice. On the first afternoon, they dug trenches along the west fence and buried 6 kegs of black powder at intervals, running fuse cord back under the fence posts to a firing pit behind the cabin. On the second morning, they stacked sandbags across every window and every corner of the porch. On the second afternoon, Silas and Orrin set bar wire in the south pasture low and mean the way Silas had once seen a Union corporal do it in the Shenandoah in '64. On the third morning, Harlow rode the North Ridge twice alone to sight the lines of approach and mark the dead ground where a man could lie in cover. When she came back, she sketched what she had seen in the dirt with a stick, and Silas and Orrin crouched around her, drawing and nodded. And that was how she became the third planner, without any of them saying it was a thing she had been made. On the third evening, with the work as done as work ever gets, Silas took down from the high shelf a bottle of Scotch whiskey he had not opened in 15 years. It had been a wedding gift from an uncle in Inverness. He had been saving it for a good occasion. He had stopped believing in those. He poured 3 tin cups. The 3 of them sat at the kitchen table in the lamplight. Orrin told a long story about a mule he had owned in 1863 that had been smarter than a congressman. Harlow told about a winter in her childhood when her mother had hidden her under a buffalo robe during a blizzard and sung her the same song for 9 hours without stopping, because stopping would have meant sleep, and sleep in that storm would have meant dying. Silas did not tell a story. He listened. He laughed once at Orrin's mule, and Orrin looked at him sharp across the table and did not say a word about the laugh, which was kind of Orrin, because if he had said anything about it, Silas might not have laughed again for another year. When the bottle was done, Orrin said his prayers, rolled himself into his blanket by the stove, and was snoring inside of 4 minutes. Silas and Harlow went out onto the porch. The stars were very clear that night, the kind of clear that only comes over high country in dry weather before a storm. Silas sat down on the top step. Harlow sat 1 step below him, her back against the post, her braid over her shoulder. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally he said, "Harlow, yes. Tomorrow a lot of men are going to come onto this ground. Some of them will not leave it. I know. If I don't see the day out," he said, and stopped and started again. "If I don't see the day out, I want to have said 2 things to you once, while I still could. Because a man who doesn't say them when he has the chance is a coward, and I have already been a few kinds of coward for 2 years, and I am tired of adding to the list." She did not turn around. She listened. "The first is that you have given me a reason to stand up in the mornings," he said. "I had not had one of those in a long while. I had my coffee and my cattle and my 3 graves, and I had the lie I was telling about them. That was not a reason. That was an excuse. You are a reason. I wanted you to hear that from me one time. Her shoulders were very still against the post. The second, he said, is harder. He looked up at the stars. He considered the 1,000 ways he could say it. He settled in the end on the simplest. I have fallen in love with you, he said. I did not know I was going to, and I did not set out to, and I know you did not come here to be loved by a graying man who talks to dead people before breakfast. I am not asking you for anything. I am telling you because it is the truth, and because I have had enough lying in this house to last me the rest of my days. The silence that followed was very long. Then she reached up without turning and laid her hand over his where it rested on the step. She did not say anything. She did not turn her face up to him. She just closed her fingers over his and held on. They sat like that until the first star in the western sky went under the ridge, and then they got up without a word and went inside, and she lay down on her pallet by the hearth, and he lay down on his bed in the corner, and that night at last he slept. He woke to Orrin shaking his shoulder. Silas, I'm up. You need to come to the porch. He came to the porch. The sun was just clear in the eastern ridge. The land was bone-colored in the early light. Orrin stood at the rail with his old brass spyglass to his eye. Harlow stood beside him, one hand on the post. Her braid freshly done, her face scrubbed clean. East, Orrin said, handing him the glass. Apache. I count 4 dozen, maybe more. Silas lifted the glass. He saw it. A long, low dust rising where the flat ran out toward the painted hills. 50 riders moving at the steady, unhurried walk of men who were not worried about arriving on time because they knew they could not be stopped. West, Orrin said. Silas moved the glass. A second dust. Smaller. Faster. Tighter. A column of riders in a hurry coming down the long slope out of the Boulder Creek country. He counted. 12. He lowered the glass. Harlow was looking at him. Both, she said quietly. Both, he said. And they'll be here within the hour of each other. Orrin laughed a short, hard bark with no humor in it. Well, hell, he said. I was worried the day would be dull. Silas did not laugh. He looked east. He looked west. Then he walked off the porch alone across the yard, around the cabin, past the corral, and out to the 3 crosses under the cottonwood tree. He stood in front of them a long time. He took off his hat. He held it in both hands. Mabel, he said, I am going to do a thing today that I should have done 2 years ago. I have been slow about it. I am sorry for being slow. I am going to try to come back because there is a woman in my kitchen who has asked me to, and because I have found I would like to. But if I do not come back, you know the place beside you is for me. Don't go anywhere. He looked at the smaller cross. Amos, Toby. Pa's sorry about the shotgun, son. Pa's sorry about the well. The wind moved once in the cottonwood leaves. He put his hat back on. He walked back to the cabin. He picked up the Winchester at the door. He did not look at the east, and he did not look at the west. He looked at Harlow standing on the porch, her black braid over her shoulder, Amos's colt on her hip. She looked back at him. "All right," he said. "Let them come." The east came first. Silas had guessed it would. An Apache chief rode the way an Apache chief had always ridden, at a pace set by the oldest horse in the column. And Nantan would not ask his elders to break a trot in the heat of the morning, just to please a white rancher. The dust on the eastern rise climbed slow and patient, a long brown smoke that only men who had ridden in cavalry could properly read. The west was a different animal. That dust was a knife. It came down the long slope from the Boulder Creek country in a tight, dense column. And it did not walk, and it did not stop to consider the land. Silas stood at the porch rail with the Winchester cradled in the crook of his good arm, and he watched both clouds come in as if they were weather. "Apache'll beat the Crowleys by 40 minutes, Orrin said, beside him, old brass glass still to his eye. "Maybe an hour. That's all we get. That's all we get." Silas turned to Harlow. She was standing at the other end of the porch braid over her shoulder, Amos's colt on her left hip. Because she had learned this week to draw cross-body, her face was very still. "Your people first," Silas said. "Hear them out. Say what you have to say. When the west dust comes over that second rise, we stop talking and we start working." "I know. If it comes to choosing," Silas said, "and I pray it does not. But if it comes to choosing you, talk to Nantan in your own tongue. Tell him what is coming. Tell him Jeb Crowley is the same man who killed a white family on this land 2 autumns past, and the same man who left you in the arroyo. Tell him this is not his quarrel. Tell him to ride on." She looked at him a long moment. "Will you tell me to do that?" she said. "If the dust is still a mile out, I will tell you to do that," Silas said. She did not argue. She did not nod either. She turned her face back to the eastern ridge, and she waited. And that was her answer. And he did not press her. They came at a walk the way he had known they would, 50 horses in 2 loose columns, with Nantan at the point. The chief was 62 years old that summer, but he sat his horse like a man 30 years younger, and his gray hair was bound in a single long braid down his back. Behind him rode Dasan, then Kel, then Taza, and behind them rode the 2 elder women, Nasha, in a deerskin dress worked with old silver dolly beside her in faded blue cotton, and behind the women rode the council, and behind the council rode the warriors young and old, and the sound of 50 walking horses on packed dirt at 100 yards was a sound that a man did not soon forget. Silas stepped down off the porch. He left the Winchester on the rail. He walked out into the yard, and he stopped in the center of it with his arms at his sides and his palms open. Harlow walked out beside him and stood on his left. Orrin walked out on his right with the shotgun broken over his forearm, an old courtesy from an old war. Nantan drew rein at 30 feet. He did not dismount at first. He looked down from the saddle at the 3 figures in the yard. His eyes went across Silas and across Orrin and came to rest on Harlow and stayed there a long time. Then in careful English he said, "Daughter of the wind, you will speak for yourself before the council one last time. If what you say turns the elders, you may come home. If not, your name will not be spoken among us after today, and the cord that ties you to your mothers will be cut, and no child of this people will ever be told you were one of us. This is the judgment. Are you ready to give your words?" Harlow lifted her chin. "I am ready." Nantan swung down from his horse. He did it slowly, not from weakness but from dignity. The other riders followed. Dasan came to stand 3 paces behind Nantan, with his hands folded in front of him. Nasha and Doli moved up on either side of the chief, and the council of elders formed behind them in a loose half-circle, and the warriors spread out in a wider ring behind the council, and the horses were led off to one side by younger men who had not yet earned a place in the inner ring. It was a court, Silas realized. They had brought a cord out of the desert to his front yard. Nantan turned to Harlow. "Speak." Harlow took a single breath. She had planned this speech Silas could see, but not written it because her people did not write speeches. She had planned it the way an old stone is planned by water, by long patient carrying of a thing inside her until the shape of it was smooth and true. She began in Apache. Her voice was low and steady. The elders' faces did not change, but Silas saw Nasha's hand close tighter on the silver at her throat, and he saw Dasan close his eyes once and open them again. Then Harlow switched to English. "I speak the rest of my words in the tongue of the man who pulled me from the dust," she said, "so that he too may understand the thing I have to say. He has earned that much from me, and more than that." She turned slowly and faced Nasher and Doli in the council. "You left me to die in the red country," she said. "You said I was made unclean by white hands. You did not ask me what happened. You did not ask me who did it. You did not ask me if I had fought. You looked at the marks on my body and you read a story on my skin that was not the true story, and you closed the circle of our people against me, and you rode away." She pulled open the front of her shirt with both hands, slow and unashamed, until her shoulders were bare to the collarbone. The welts there, some faded and some still raw, were plainly visible in the morning sun. She turned so that her back was to the elders. Nasha stepped forward. The old woman was weeping already. Silas saw, though her face had not moved. The tears ran down the seams of her face without disturbing them. Nasha laid her fingers against one of the longest of the scars on Harlow's back, and then she drew in a breath that shook her shoulders, and she turned to Nantan and spoke 3 words in Apache. She says. Harlow translated quietly without turning around. "These are white whips with iron hooks, not ours." A sound went through the council. Not a word. Something older than a word. Silas had heard that kind of sound only once in his life at a cavalry funeral in '64. When the color guard had lowered the flag, and the widow had finally understood what the folded triangle meant. Harlow pulled her shirt closed. She turned back around. I did not ruin myself, she said. I did not shame our people. 3 white men took me at the river where I was cutting medicine. They kept me in a rock cut for 14 days. They did these things to me because my husband once had killed the brother of the worst of them. I was a debt they meant to collect. When they were finished with me, they left me in the arroyo for you to find, and they left a white woman's keepsake around my neck to confuse you, because the worst of them thought it would be amusing. She looked at Dasan. Dasan had not moved. His face was cut stone. Some of you knew, Harlow said, and her voice went quieter but did not shake. Some of you did not ask because you were afraid of the answer. Some of you rode away that day with the weight of a thing you had not said. I am looking at one of you now. Dasan did not look away. It took him a count of 5, but he did not look away. Then slowly he came forward out of the line of warriors. He walked past Nantan. He walked past Nasha. He walked to within 2 paces of Harlow. And then he went down on one knee in the dust of Silas Holloway's yard. He did not speak in English. He did not need to. Every soul in that yard, whether they knew the words or not, understood what was passing between the warrior on his knee and the woman standing in front of him. When he was done, he stayed on the knee. Harlow looked down at him for a long moment. "Stand up, Dasan," she said in English, and her voice was not cold. It was only tired. "This is not a day for kneeling. There is not enough day left." He stood. He stepped back into the line. Nantan turned his head slowly. First to Nasha, then to Dolly. Nasha gave him one small nod. Dolly did the same. Nantan faced Harlow. "The council acknowledges error," he said. He did not soften the word. He did not hide behind ceremony. "You were judged on what we saw, and we saw wrong. The judgment is withdrawn. Your name stands in our line. Your mother's mother's mothers are restored to you. You may come home." Harlow bowed her head. Then she lifted it again. "I thank the council," she said. "I honor the council, but I am not coming home." A ripple went through the elders, not anger, surprise. "I have a home now," Harlow said. She turned her head and looked at the cabin, and at Silas and at Oren, and then back at Nantan. "The man who pulled me from the dust has given me a roof and a name and a reason to keep breathing when I had set mine down. I will not leave him. I ask only this, that I remain of the people though I walk a different road." She faced Nasha. "Grandmother," she said, "give me a sign I may carry so that wherever I am, my mothers know I am still theirs." Nasha stepped forward without hesitation. She reached up to her own throat and untied the cord that held a small pendant of carved bone and eagle feather, the piece that had belonged to her own grandmother and her grandmother before her. She stepped up to Harlow and lifted the cord over Harlow's head and settled it against her collarbone. Daughter, Nasha said in English, "You remain ours. You only walk a different road." And then the first rifle cracked on the western ridge, and one of the young warriors at the back of the gathering went down with his throat open, and the day turned. A boy dropped. Not a man. A boy of perhaps 18 holding the rein of Cale's horse, his knees folded under him, and he was on his back in the dust before the sound of the shot had finished traveling across the yard. 2 more shots came almost at once, kicking pale plumes out of the ground near the council. Silas did not think. He had been a cavalry corporal at 21 in a valley in Virginia, and some old wire in his chest that had lain cold for 23 years snapped hot all at once. "Inside the walls," he roared, and his voice carried across the yard like a cannon. "Every man, every horse inside the walls now." Nantan's head came up. For one breath, Silas saw the old chief weigh it. A white man's orders, a white man's fortifications on a day the council had come to pass judgment. Silas knew he was asking Nantan to swallow something large and swallow it fast. Nantan swallowed it. He turned on his heel and he shouted 3 short words in Apache, and 50 warriors moved as one. The horses were hauled through the gate by their leads. The elder women were carried Nasha in Dasan's arms doli, on the back of Taza's running shoulders. The wounded boy was lifted by 4 hands and brought in before the blood had finished leaving him. The gate was closed behind them and barred with the oak beam Silas had cut for that purpose 3 days before. It took 90 seconds. Silas had not known 50 strangers could move like that. It was a thing he would remember. Rifle fire was coming steady now from the west ridge. The Crowleys had taken up cover in the rocks above the cabin. They had not come down into the valley. They were too smart for that. They were settling in for a long fight, and their shots were starting to come in patient and aimed. Silas dropped behind the sandbags at the south porch. Harlow slid in beside him on his left. Orrin was already behind the west sandbags. Shotgun broken open, thumbing shells into both barrels with the calm of an old man who had done it at Antietam. Nantan came up the porch steps at a crouch. "You have fought white men before," the chief said. "I have. You command this ground. I command my people. We will work as 2 hands of one body. Good. Your west wall." Orrin. "My warriors fill the north. Dasan takes the south rise beside you. 10 with me in the center as reserve. The elder women into the cabin for the wounded." "Good," Silas said again. Nantan nodded once and was gone. For 15 minutes it was mostly noise. The Crowleys fired from cover. The Apache fired back from cover. Most of it was wasted powder. 2 warriors at the north wall took grazes. One of the Crowleys. Silas saw him clear in the glass. A gaunt man in a red wool shirt stood up too high to work his rifle's action and went over backward with a neat dark hole above his eyebrow, courtesy of a young Apache at the north fence who had not, as far as Silas could tell, been taught marksmanship by anyone Silas would ever meet. Then Jeb Crowley's voice came up out of the rocks. "Holloway!" Silas had been waiting for it. "Holloway, you still walking?" The voice was hoarse from shouting over distance, but it was the same voice. The splinter that had lived in his chest for 23 months turned on its own point. "I am still walking, Jeb," Silas called back. "You remember my face, Holloway?" "I do not." "Your woman remembered it just fine." Silas did not answer that one. Jeb did not need him to. I done her Holloway, September of '85. I kept your gal an hour and a half before I finished her. She begged for the boy. She begged pretty. I let him go for 2 seconds before I put the knife in and the little one Holloway. I dropped the little one down the well so she could listen him die. Silas felt Harlow's hand close around his forearm. Her grip was hard, harder than he would have expected. He did not move. He did not speak. He breathed once in through his nose and out through his mouth, and then again, and a third time, and he felt the old cold quiet come down over him, the way a saddle blanket comes down over a horse's back. The cold quiet he had known when he had walked out of the kitchen of his own house and sat down on the porch step and said to God, "You and I are done." He had not been done. He had thought he was. He had not been. "Jeb," Silas called back, and his voice came out of him level, as a spirit-leveled plumb line. "Mabel did not beg you for anything. I knew her better than you will ever know another living soul. She bit her tongue bloody before she will give you one thing to carry away. Amos did not cry. Toby did not cry. You are going to die on this ground this morning, and no one will know where." The laugh came back up out of the rocks, but it was a shorter laugh than Jeb Crowley had intended. Silas turned his face to Harlow. "You cover me from the 10 o'clock corner," he said. "Jeb has 3 men in the split rock to the left. Put shots into that crack at a steady count. I do not need you to hit them. I need them flinching. Silas, I am not arguing with you, Harlow." She looked at him. Then she nodded one sharp, small nod, and she was gone up the porch to the corner post. Silas went over the wall. He did not run straight. He ran zigzag across the open yard, the way he had run across a meadow in Virginia once, when he was 21, only slower now because a man of 48 with a half-healed shoulder did not run the way a boy did, and because he had not cared then whether he made it to the far side of the meadow, and he cared now. Harlow's covering fire cracked from the 10 o'clock corner. One shot, another patient, and metronomic. Silas heard the Crowleys' return fire go high over him as the shooters in the split rock flinched from her rounds. He made the lee of a great upthrust red boulder on the near east face of the ridge, and he crouched there in its shadow, panting, his right shoulder burning against the old bandage, his left hand on the grip of Amos's Colt. He waited for his wind. He listened. Somewhere above him a boot scraped on stone. Silas Holloway had grown up hunting mule deer in rough country. He had spent 30 summers learning what a boot on stone sounded like from below. He climbed. He came up on Jeb Crowley from behind an outcrop that Jeb had thought half an hour earlier was covering his flank. Jeb was crouched with a Winchester braced against a notch of rock, working the lever, steadily firing down into the yard, with the patient calm of a man who had decided the fight was his, to win by mathematics. His long black hair was tied back with a thong. His left-hand pistol was in its holster. He had a bowie knife in his boot, and another bowie knife at his belt, and a third knife small at his collar. He was a walking armory. He was not expecting a man to come up the rocks behind him. Silas was out of rifle rounds. He had fired his last at a rider on the west slope 2 minutes before. He set the Winchester down against the rock quiet as a held breath. He drew Amos's Colt with his left hand. He stepped out into the open behind Jeb Crowley at 4 yards, and he said very softly, "Jeb." Jeb Crowley turned. He was fast. Silas had known he would be. Jeb had his left-hand pistol out of the holster before Silas had finished the second syllable of the man's name, and the 2 shots went almost together, the Colt in Silas's left hand and the revolver in Jeb's. Jeb's round took Silas high in the same shoulder that had not yet finished healing from Rance's. Silas's round took Jeb just above the belt buckle. Jeb went down on one knee against the rock. His pistol clattered. He did not drop the Bowie knife he pulled from his boot on the way down, and he came up off the knee with it low and fast, and Silas could not fire again because the Colt had jammed on the empty casing. The Colt had always done that if you did not keep the action warm. And now the 2 of them were on each other with knives. It was a short fight. It was not a clean fight. Silas took a cut across his forearm that he did not feel until later. He took a long slash along the side of his chest that parted his shirt and his skin and one rib. Jeb took a Bowie through the meat of his left thigh and a second cut across the palm of his knife hand that made him shift the blade to his weaker hand, and then Silas closed with him shoulder to shoulder and drove him back against the rock, and he did not stab. He drove. He drove Jeb Crowley's head back against the upthrust point of the boulder once hard, with the full weight of 23 months of carrying 3 graves up a hill every morning. Jeb's skull made a sound on the stone that Silas did not wish to describe to anyone afterward. Jeb slid down the rock. His eyes went unfocused, and then focused again, narrower, knowing. He looked up at Silas with a kind of terrible, clear interest, as if a long, private question of his had just been answered. "Finish me," he said. Silas looked down at him for a long moment. "No," he said. "Finish me, Holloway." "No," Silas said again. "You are going to lie here. You are going to bleed out alone with the wind in these rocks. No one is going to hold your hand. No one is going to know which ridge you died on. There will not be a cross. There will not be a name on a stone. Where my wife and my boys are buried, I come every morning and I pour coffee on the ground and I say their names out loud. No one will ever say your name again, Jeb Crowley. That is how you end. That is the last thing I am going to give you." He turned. He picked up his Winchester. He walked down off the ridge. He did not look back. Behind him in the split rock, Jeb Crowley made one sound. It was a sound Silas heard and did not turn for. And it was the last sound in the world Jeb Crowley ever made. And Silas did not carry it with him down the mountain the way he had carried the laugh. He left that one up there. The fight was ending as he came down. Rance Crowley had made a run for a horse in the low cover and had been dropped at 30 yards by Desan, who had the eye of a man who had grown up throwing a spear and who took to a Winchester the way some men took to prayer. 3 of the Crowley riders who had started the morning up in the rocks were on their way back to Sonora at full gallop and would not be back. One more had thrown down his rifle and walked out of the rocks with his hands high, and an Apache warrior with a very steady demeanor had tied his wrists behind him and set him on the ground against a fence post. 8 of the 12 had gone in the ground. On the other side, 7 warriors of the Red Mesa lay still in the yard. Orrin Bellamy was sitting against the wall of the cabin with his trouser leg cut open and a long red furrow in his calf that would make him limp for the rest of his life, but would not kill him. Nasha and Dolly were moving among the wounded, doing the kind of work old women do in country that has not forgotten how to knead them. Silas walked out of the rocks and into the yard. Harlow was on him before he had crossed halfway. She ran. She did not call his name. She just ran, and she hit him at full stride and wrapped her arms around him and put her face in the side of his neck. And she did not cry, and she did not speak, and she held him for a count of 10, maybe 12. He put his good arm around her, and he held on. When she stepped back, her hands went to the slash along his ribs, and the other along his forearm, and the fresh bloom of dark across the shoulder that had only just started to close, and she made a small sound at the back of her throat that he had not heard her make before. "It is all right," he said. "It is all right, Harlow. It is nothing that a stitch will not handle." "You are a liar, Silas Holloway." "I am, but it is still all right." Nantan came up behind her and stopped 3 paces off. The old chief looked at Silas for a long moment. Then he did a thing Silas had not expected and had not prepared for. Nantan dipped his head, not the nod of one man to another, a deeper thing, a bow. "The blood of my warriors is in this dirt," Nantan said. "So is yours. The ground is changed. From this day, Silas Holloway, you are a friend of the Red Mesa, and my people are a friend of your house. When you need us, you send word. When we need you, we know where you are." Silas took his hat off. It was the only thing he knew to do. "Thank you," he said. "Do not thank," Nantan said. "Remember." Evening. The light had gone long and red, and the dust had settled, and the work had been done. The Apache dead carried to a place on the east slope where their own would come in the following days to take them home. The cabin cleared. Orrin propped in the rocker with his leg up and a cup of whiskey balanced on the arm, and a faint, offended look on his face at the fact that a man of his age had been hit by a bullet at all. Desan walked up to the porch alone. In his hand was the wooden deer. "I took this," he said quietly to Harlow, "the day my men brought me to the place we thought you had died. I did not know why I was taking it. I only knew I could not leave it in that dirt. I have carried it in my saddlebag for 23 days. I think I was carrying it for him." He held it out. Silas took it. He held it in his left palm. The wood was worn very smooth, more than it had been when Amos had made it. It had lived in a man's pocket for 2 years. It had been worked by a murderer's thumb in quiet moments around fires on trails during long rides. Silas considered that for a moment, and then he let the thought go, because the carving had not been ruined by where it had been. It had only found its way home. He closed his fingers around it. "Mabel brought her to me," he said. "Not to Dasan, not to Harlow. To the 3 crosses under the cottonwood which he could not see from where he was standing, but which he had not looked away from since the day he came home from El Paso, and never would. All right, Mabel. All right." The rain came an hour after sundown. It came slow at first, a few fat drops on the porch roof. Then more than the steady, long drumming of a real rain, the kind the high country had not had in 4 months. Silas and Harlow walked out into it together, barefoot, with their arms at their sides, and they stood in front of the 3 crosses as the water came down on them. Silas laid the wooden deer on the top of Mabel's cross. "This came home," he said. "It came home with a good woman attached. I'm going to keep the woman. You keep the deer." Harlow unfastened the bone and feather pendant Nasha had hung around her neck that morning, and she laid it carefully on the earth at the foot of Mabel's cross beside the carving. "Sister," she said in English so that Silas would understand, "I do not know your face. I will not meet you in this world. But you raised a good man, and you married him, and you set him up to be found by a woman in a hole in the ground. I will walk the road with him from here. I will do my best by him. Lend me the pendant for a while, and keep the deer in trade." She stepped back. Silas took her hand in the rain. They stood there a long time, and the water ran down their faces, and none of it was for grief anymore. 6 months later, spring in the high country of New Mexico. The grass had come back up in the bottomland blue and thick, and the cottonwood behind the cabin had leafed out full, and the 3 crosses under it looked almost gentle in the new light. Silas had cut a 4th cross smaller and set it in the plot as a marker stone, not for another grave, but for an empty place where he had carved in a steady, patient hand the ones who led Harlow home. The cattle count was up to 240 head. The loan at the Red Butte Bank was paid. The deed to the ranch had been carried from the bank to the cabin in Silas's own saddlebag and laid on the kitchen table. And Harlow had looked at it a long moment before she said, "So this is the piece of paper that made your grandfather matter to this country." And Silas had laughed. He had been doing more laughing lately. It still surprised him when he did it. Orrin had moved into the small east room of the cabin and had never moved out. He cooked breakfast most mornings now on account of his leg, and he complained about it steady, which Silas had come to understand was Orrin's way of being happy. Dasan rode over once a month. He brought venison. He stayed for one meal. He spoke a handful of sentences in Apache to Harlow, and she answered him, and they did not touch. Silas did not need them to explain it to him. Some old doors you close and you do not open. You only stand near them once in a while to make sure they are still shut. On a Tuesday afternoon in late April, Silas rode into Red Butte to see the bankman about nothing. A man who had just paid off a loan had a different relationship with the bank, and Silas was coming to enjoy it. And on the way out of town, he stopped by the low stone building on the north edge where a widow named Mrs. Tarrant was running what she called an orphanage, and what everyone else called Mrs. Tarrant's house. Smallpox had come through in February. It had taken whole families on the Cimarron. Mrs. Tarrant had 7 children she had not had in December. One of them was a boy of 10 years with brown eyes and a serious face, and his mother's name still fresh on his lip. A boy who stood very straight when he was introduced to a stranger, and who said when Silas asked him his name, "Wyatt Finch, sir." "Do you know cattle, Wyatt Finch?" "No, sir. My father did dry goods." "Can you learn?" "Yes, sir." "Do you mind horses?" "I like horses, sir. I have not been near enough of them." Silas looked at the boy for a long time. The boy looked back, unflinching the way a child looks at an adult when the child has already survived the worst thing that will ever happen to him, and has decided privately that he is not going to be afraid of anything smaller. Silas rode home at a walk. He did not hurry. He thought the whole way. He found Harlow in the kitchen cutting onions. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand. "Harlow." "Yes." "There is a boy at Mrs. Tarrant's, 10 years old, both parents gone. His name is Wyatt Finch. He does not know horses, but he wants to learn. He stands up straight. I do not want to replace anyone. I do not want to pretend anyone back into the world. I only want to say there is a boy and we have a room, and I have been thinking about it since lunch." She set the knife down. She wiped her hands on her apron. She came across the kitchen and she laid her palm flat against the side of his face. "You think she sent him," Harlow said. "I think she might have." "Then bring him," Harlow said. They brought him on a Friday. He had a cloth sack with everything he owned in it, which was not much. He rode in front of Silas on the sorrel, both of his small hands gripping the saddle horn, and when they came over the last rise in the cabin and the cottonwood and the fence lines came into view below them, Silas felt the boy's shoulders go still, the way a young animal's shoulders go still at the first sight of a place it is gonna live. Orrin was on the porch with a coffee cup. Harlow was at the door in the blue wool shawl. Silas reined up at the rail. He dismounted. He lifted the boy down. "Wyatt Finch," he said. "This is my wife, Harlow Holloway. This is Mr. Orrin Bellamy, who lives with us. The horse you just rode in on is named Dove. This is your house for as long as you want it to be, and I do not think I will change my mind on that. Do you understand me, son?" Wyatt Finch looked up at him. "Yes, sir." "All right, then." Harlow came down the porch steps. She did not rush. She knelt down in the dust in front of the boy, so that her face was level with his, and she looked at him for a long, quiet moment. And then she said, "There are 3 graves behind this house under the big tree. The people in them were loved. We are not going to ask you to love them. We are only going to ask you to let them be. When you are older, you may visit them with me if you want. If you never do that, is also all right. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good," Harlow said. "Come inside. There is stew." She took his hand and the boy took hers, and the 2 of them went up the porch steps together. And Silas stood in the yard with the reins of the sorrel in his hand, and watched them go. Orrin looked down at him from the porch. "Silas, yeah, you all right?" "I am all right, Orrin. You are crying a little. I know it." "All right then," Orrin said, and he turned and limped inside after them, and the door of the cabin closed. Silas stood alone in the yard for a minute. He led the sorrel to the corral. He unsaddled her. He rubbed her down. He gave her water. He hung the bridle on its peg. Then he walked around the cabin, slow past the woodpile, and past the kitchen garden under the cottonwood, and he stopped in front of the 3 crosses and the 4th marker stone. He took off his hat. "Mabel," he said, "there is a boy in the kitchen. He is not ours. I will not pretend he is. But you might have noticed him along the way and given him a nudge. Thank you. If you did not, well, I am going to thank you anyway. It has been working out to thank you for most things." He was quiet a long moment. "I'm going to be all right now, Mabel. I did not know that for a while. I know it now. You can rest. I will still come out here in the mornings. I will still pour the cup. I will not stop doing that until I go in the ground beside you. But I am going to be all right in between." The wind moved once in the cottonwood leaves. He put his hat back on. He walked back around the cabin in the red evening light. He went up the porch steps. He opened the door. Inside at his kitchen table, a woman who had once been left for dead in the red dust was setting out 4 bowls of stew, and a man who had once sat alone on that same porch for 2 winters straight was pouring the coffee, and a boy with a cloth sack at his feet was looking around the room with the careful eyes of a child who was beginning, against all the odds stacked on his small head, to believe that the place was real. Silas closed the door behind him. He sat down at his own table at the head of it, and he picked up his spoon, and for the first time in a very long time, he bowed his head over a full bowl of food in a full house, and he said grace out loud. The land outside the window went on for 100 miles in every direction. It had tested him. It had buried him. It had, in its own slow and indifferent way, given him back more than it had taken. He ate his supper with his family. That was the end of the story, and also the beginning of the rest of it.